So to summarize, there's a parallel situation that we could lay out, which is supposed to be similar to the relationship between the capitalist and the proletariat. And it's an analogy with a creditor and a debtor. And someone takes out a loan, they create some profit, but there's interest, so the creditor ends up getting more money than he loaned out. And this parallels the situation that happens with the capitalist, who is kind of, in a way, I see the analogy here, he's loaning out the capital. He's kind of like loaning out the ability for the person to create the good. And so it's supposed to be kind of an intuition, I'm guessing, for us, like, this isn't unfair. Like, it's not unfair for a creditor to get interest when they make a loan if everyone's agreeing to it, right?
Well, no, actually, the intuition is supposed to be, look, there's nothing special about labor relationships, right? We can replace this with any other kind of market. It just happens to be the case that Marx focused on labor markets, but we can see this kind of inequality in other markets as well. And the nature of the relationship is the same. So it basically means that if we're going to talk about exploitation, at least we shouldn't be focused only on these kind of labor relationships. The traditional Marxists think that there might be other reasons that labor markets are special. For instance, at the point of production, on factory floors and such, there might be aggressive relationships between capitalists and people like foremen, people who are higher ranked than the lower workers, that lead to alienation and relationships of domination that are negative. But once again, Romer replies to this by saying we can have these sorts of relationships also in other markets. So even for that kind of thing, it's not clear that labor markets are so critical and so should be viewed as special compared to different markets.
Yeah, I'm thinking that's just kind of how Marx is in a way dated, because he was looking at industries that use like heavy moving parts and say like maybe like cotton gins or assembly lines, where there wasn't really that many other types of popular industrial labors as though we have today. So I guess he's just speaking in a historical sense, and that's maybe why the Marxist sort of favors certain industries or certain types of labor over, say, like modern economies, perhaps, like, say, like software or finance or technology or something.
Yeah, I remember hearing a talk because in anticipation for the show, I was kind of looking up some stuff from Romer. I heard him giving a talk. He gave that very example. He was talking about Apple. Like, there wasn't a market like that back then where someone could just storm the steel industry. But, I mean, Apple kind of just did storm the computer industry and, like, beat down IBM, who was dominating it for so long before that. So there's a move here where he's saying we shouldn't be so focused on labor relations. There's all types of economic relationships. But I was still gathering that this argument's supposed to show that in a creditor-debtor relationship, there's nothing wrong, right? Isn't that supposed to be what's happening? There's nothing wrong with that relationship. Right?
Oh, I see. So there's a sense in which you're right, because Romer doesn't think that this kind of definition of exploitation is correct, but he is saying here that let's assume this definition of exploitation is true. There's no reason why, if we're so concerned with this kind of relationship, that we shouldn't apply it to other markets as well. But incidentally, he thinks you could have a creditor-debtor relationship of this kind that's not unjust so long as the bargaining power between each party is equal. So it could be the case that the creditor and the debtor in that situation, even if the debtor has to pay a lot of interest, that they reached that sort of agreement from a position of equal bargaining power. And if that's the case, then according to Romer, it's perfectly justified, even though there is this kind of surplus value.
Okay, so it's not a necessary condition. And now most
Right.
people probably don't think in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions. It's sort of more of a norm in political theory and generally in philosophy. So it's not necessary because that would entail that these are the necessary elements. You must have all of it. And so the next move is to show that it's also not sufficient. Actually, before going into that, I kind of want to sort of recap what we're doing and what's the point of it and why I think this is important and interesting. Liberals and, progressives, socialists generally want to make certain arguments about why we shouldn't have laissez-faire capitalism or why unrestricted, unmitigated market systems lead to something bad. And typically, they've relied on exploitation as that bad. Marx relied on exploitation as that bad. Exploitation's clearly bad. But more modern Marxists have made arguments to try to show that this isn't going to work. And as Clay and I typically espouse sort of Marxist views, sort of from actually the same kind of camp as Romer, who Tristan's here talking about today, the analytical Marxist camp, or no BS Marxists. Can't really say the name of their brand of Marxism. That makes it extra kind of cool. You can't say the name of their kind of Marxism in this capitalist society. So it's supposed to make Marxism better. Or if you're a capitalist, it could do the work to show that Marxism doesn't work. And if I recall, I mean, you might have been anticipating getting to this point, so I don't want to get to it too much before you, but it kind of brings up a question against Marxists. What makes you a Marxist? If you've abandoned this definition of exploitation, then you're just a liberal. You're not a socialist. So we've gone through some reasons to think that this traditional concept of Marxism is wrong so far. We've gone against the necessary conditions. So now there are more arguments against it to try to show that the existence of surplus value is also not sufficient. It's also its existence alone, if I'm correct, does not suffice to show exploitation.
Okay, so this is how Romer's going to set up the example to show that it's not sufficient. What he does first is he calls upon us to imagine this scenario where there's only one good in the world, corn, and the subsistence level is B bushels per day. And imagine that everyone lives on their own island, basically, and has an equal division of seed corn, which is required to produce this corn, and they each have half a B bushels. And imagine that it requires something like 12 hours to produce B bushels. So and they need half a B seed corn to do this. So basically everyone starts with the same amount of capital, everyone works the same amount, and they all live on subsistence. So clearly in that case, there's no exploitation, right? So there aren't even relationships between people that could be called economic relationships. So Romer takes it as obvious that there's no exploitation here.
Yeah, wait, what's the name of this type of economy again? There's a name for it.
So this is called an autarky, a situation where everyone is working for their subsistence and no one is trading. Now, imagine that we join these people together and you have different types of work that produce corn at different rates. So let's say you have some factory technology that can produce corn very quickly, in farm technology that takes a longer time. Romer, it's quite complex, but Romer figures out a way that you could divide the labor among these different technologies, and you could make it such that the people who control, you can make it such that certain people offer capital or seed corn in exchange for wages and take a surplus value of corn from that labor. But everyone ends up working 12 hours still, and everyone still ends up with subsistence, which is just 1 B bushels. So even though there's surplus, and even though there are these labor relationships in which people are technically being exploited, according to the Marxist definition, it's clear that it would be absurd to say that there's exploitation here. Because why? Because if we look at the actual results of what's going on, everyone is working the same amount. Everyone's working 12 hours still. Everyone's receiving the same amount of corn, which is B bushels, just the necessary subsistence level. And it's also the case that, as it turns out in his example, he's able to make it such that everyone works the same amount of hours. In fact, it might even be better than the autarky situation because people are allowed to or able to work different kinds of labor. And some people might like working on farms better than in factories and vice versa. So Romer says, look, this is not exploitation. This relationship is symbiotic. So there's something wrong with saying that exploitation has to be based on a surplus value definition.